Reprise des débats. Alors...
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am rising in this House today in order to speak on a subject that is the focus of our attention for many months, and has been, and requires constant vigilance, the situation in Libya. As we know, the evolution of the situation there, the NATO intervention, and the future of the country are at the heart of political discussions in Canada and also on the international scene. Closer to home, this has sparked marked interest on the part of parliamentarians, both in committees and in the House. We have closely watched what is going on in Libya, and we want to support the population in its future efforts. Mr. Speaker, my remarks today will focus on the NATO intervention in Libya, the current situation, my opposition to the motion tabled by the Conservative government, and the importance of the amendments proposed by the NDP. First, allow me to provide a context concerning the NATO's intervention in Libya. It is part of the movement that we now call the Arab Spring. The Libya uprisings began on February 15th of this year. 5 days later, in Benghazi, it spread to the entire country, and 2 days later, the regime of Muammar Gaddafi lost control of certain regions. The Libyan public took to the streets to denounce injustice, oppression, a lack of fairness, and the dark-heartedness of the government in place. The courage and determination of the protesters impressed us all. Facing up to an authoritarian regime that has been in place for over 40 years and risking one's life deserves respect and honor. These people had the courage to challenge the established order, in addition to overturning a corrupt and threatening government. However, from the outset of these protests, the massive and horrific repression on the part of Muammar Gaddafi shocked and horrified us all. There were attacks against civilians, massacres in many regions of the country, offensive against people who were not armed, and the use of rape as a weapon of war. In short, the oppression of this dictatorship reached a summit after 4 decades of existence. This oppression menaced the physical and mental well-being of the population and regional stability. UN Resolutions 1970 and 1973 sent a clear message. The international community would not accept to stand by while a population was massacred, and it wanted to step in to counter these massacres. From that angle, that is the responsibility to protect, the NDP supported the initial intervention that was militarily based and launched by NATO, as well as its renewal in June 2011. My colleagues and I want civilians to be protected. We want Gaddafi and his troops to be no longer be able to cause harm, and we want rule of law for Libya. That is why we deployed CF-18s from Canada in order to support NATO operations that were legitimate and commendable. Canada performed 820 airstrikes, 9% of all NATO strikes. Canada carried out 352 refueling sorties, air-to-air sorties, which is 7% of all refueling missions. We conducted 85% of all maritime patrol missions, that is 151 sorties, and we also dropped 600 laser-guided bombs. Mr. Speaker, we have done our work. We've done our share. We are proud of the work done by our soldiers. We are proud of their actions, and I would like to thank them personally for their excellent work. And I know that all my colleagues from all political backgrounds join me in doing so. However, Mr. Speaker, today we have reached a new point. The reality is not the same as it was a few months ago. The needs are not the same, and Canada's contribution is not the same, and it must be adapted to the new reality. Tripoli is freed. The dictatorial regime has fallen, and the combats between the troops that are faithful to the former dictator and the rebels are limited to 3 cities. Life is getting back to normal. Mr. Speaker, the balance has shifted. On the one hand, the Gaddafi regime has been contained and cannot ensure the sovereignty of the country. It cannot attack civilians on a massive scale. It has lost. The regime has been defeated. On the other hand, the National Transitional Council has been recognized and supported by the international community. It has established and stabilized its positions across the country. It has achieved its first goal, which was to overturn the regime of Gaddafi. It has won, and the population has combated fear. If we compare the situation with the situation today, with that of 3 months ago, with that of 6 months ago, no one can say that no one can deny that the country is doing better. Everyone knows that the fall of the regime is good for everyone. Libya is on the right track. The assets of the former regime that were frozen have mostly been unblocked by the international community, and these billions of dollars are now available to the NTC to begin the rebuilding of the new Libya. Unfortunately, this new Libya also lacks solid institutions, a rule of law, national structures that are able to meet the main requirements of the population. The new Libya is a country that needs humanitarian aid, logistics, and technical support. The most serious fears now are the absence of a rule of law, corruption, a failed justice system, and primary needs that have not been met. This country needs our expertise in order to build the future. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to go to the heart of the matter, that is the motion tabled by the government. Several elements draw my attention, and especially regarding how the Conservatives approach this subject. Many of these elements confuse me. I will be addressing the military component of the mission, the rule of law, the protection of civilians, and Canada's role on the international scene. In my opinion, this motion does not take reality into account. It does not take into account priority needs. It is not consistent with regard to the principles that it advocates. First, on our side of the House, we deplore the government's approach because it is focused mainly on the military contribution, on the role of the Canadian armed forces. We are proud of the work our soldiers have done. We are proud of how they've contributed to this intervention. However, we feel that it is now high time for Canada to shift its focus to humanitarian aid. Canada's strength has always been its expertise in democracy, human rights, justice, social and economic development. We should build on this strength. This is what we should focus on. Therefore, we do not want to support the continued military action of Canada in Libya, and we do not believe that this should be the priority. The military mission, which began in March and was extended to June, sought to protect the Libyan people from the violence of the Gaddafi regime. We thus thank our military officers and our diplomats who have worked for us. Today, we are not at the same point in the actions we have taken, and we thus need to change them. The humanitarian channels are open and safe. The primary needs on the ground are not the same. We must now build the future of the country. The resources that we devote to the military component are resources that the government will take away from the humanitarian aid, and we all know that. $10 million per month for the military operations. That is $10 million per month that will not go to the Libyan people. That is $330,000 per day. And that same amount will not go to rebuilding the nation. Canada's action must no longer look to the past, it must look to the future. We must focus on preparing the new Libya for the challenges that await it. It must be able to build a new justice system, train police officers, develop institutions, and promise democracy. We must also support the building of a new state so that it can meet the primary needs of today and tomorrow's public. A great deal of work awaits, and we must establish our priorities. As of now, civilian resources must be focused on. As of now, humanitarian and technical resources must take over the military contribution from Canada. It is the future of Libya that we must prepare now. The motion also states that the House continue to support Canada's commitment in all spheres of rebuilding a new Libya, which includes human rights, democratic development, and the rule of law, that the House deplores the acts of violence committed by the former regime to the Libyan people, especially the supposed recourse to rape as a weapon of war. Obviously, we cannot be against this part of the motion, but where I am confused is how this aspect does not go far enough. We advocate, like all parliamentarians, the rule of law in Libya, and we want the crimes committed by the former regime to be punished. However, this rule of law can only be achieved by a representative political system. It requires the development of a fair justice system. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the NTC is not the only possible government replacement. In a recent report, Amnesty International deplored the crimes committed by the Gaddafi clan, but also by the NTC. For example, summary executions, hangings in public forums, torture, massive arrests that were unfounded. To date, all the people involved in these war crimes have not been arrested or judged. If the government wants to be consistent with the positions it has taken, it must denounce the crimes committed by both parties, and it must ensure that these crimes do not go unpunished. It must ensure that Libya has the tools it needs to ensure rule of law in the country. People who have committed war crimes cannot and should not be responsible for rebuilding Libyan democracy. This brings me back to my first point. We must establish our priorities based on our values and our hopes for all Libyans. If the government's priority is to drop bombs, well, so be it. But our priority is to establish a strong and fair Libyan society. We believe that setting up a rule of law must be based on the judgment of crimes on both parties, on both sides, through diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. The motion also focuses on the protection of civilians. Of course, we are for this. Who would be opposed to this? However, when we study the situation in depth, we realize that it is more complex than what the government would have us believe. The structures of the former regime are not as easy to identify as they were at the beginning of the intervention. The Gaddafi clan's operations are more subtle. They do not represent the same level of deployment as 3 or 6 months ago. Those who are faithful to the former regime are even better hidden than they were before, and therefore future fighting will take place on the ground more than bombing, because this would constitute a true threat for the safety of civilians and the perception of the population towards the international community's operation. In any bombing sortie, even if it is very surgical, civilians are often involuntary targets, and we want to avoid this. Perhaps for the government it is only collateral damage, but we feel that it must be avoided at all costs. In addition, NATO does not talk about any ground landings, and so this will have to be continued by the NTC. Currently, the NTC has the tools to do so. It has the weapons, logistical and strategic support, and it has a tactical advantage. Furthermore, the fighters who are faithful to Gaddafi, as specified by the representatives of the Canadian Army who appeared before committee, will run out of arms and staff in a short time. The approach advocated by the Conservatives underlines the difference between this government and traditional Canadian action on the international scene. Historically, our country played a peaceful role. Our country played a positive role. Our country played a proactive role. This government, Mr. Speaker, focuses solely on the military approach. It is taking the easy way out instead of focusing its resources on where they could be used best. It refuses to think about the future of a country that needs a strong future and solid structures. Why does the government not come back to what has traditionally been our strength? Why does it not come back to what made our country so appreciated across the planet? Why is this government so determined to give priority to weapons rather than humanitarian action? In conclusion, the NDP is opposed to this motion because it does not take into account reality or the future. It does not take into account the true contribution that Canada can make to Libya. Therefore, we say no to the motion and no to the military approach focused on by the Conservative government. But we say yes to humanitarian support to Libya on the part of Canada. Mr. Speaker, that is why we tabled 2 amendments that aim to recenter the motion on humanitarian factors rather than on the military approach. They put the focus on the real needs of the population. They will orient Canada toward its true historical mission. Because, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government must understand that Libya is more than exchanging gunfire. It is more than bombing. It is more than a civil war. Libya is 6 million people. 6 million people who want to be freed from oppression. 6 million people who have said no to the dictatorship and chosen freedom. 6 million people who now want to take their destiny in hand, look to the future, and build a better country. Today, Canada's duty is to help Libyans to build a modern society that meets the aspirations of a people, and it is not through a military mission that they will be able to do so.
Conformément à l'article 30.
It is my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows.
East on Afghanistan, the Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands on the environment. Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened intently to the member opposite's speech, and I appreciate her position. But what she needs to appreciate is, in order to first be able to deliver humanitarian aid to the people who need it in Libya, you have to first have security. And that's one of the things we're putting forward here. We need to make sure that there is security, that the people on the ground can deliver the humanitarian aid that is sent from other countries. That's one of the important reasons, and one of the reasons that we are, of course, extending this mission to Libya. If you don't first have security, you can't have the humanitarian aid getting to the places it needs to get to. For example, many parts of the remote part of Libya, pro-Gaddafi forces are interfering with humanitarian aid getting to the people who need it. So if she wants to have humanitarian aid reaching out to people who need it across the country of Libya, she must first acknowledge that security is a necessary factor for the second to take place. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to indicate to my colleague that I am aware of the importance of security to be able to deliver, for example, humanitarian assistance. But when we're talking about this type of security, we're talking about the security on the ground. Right now, we have people who are ensuring that security to make sure that the assistance can be delivered. The Canadians are not actually providing that service because we have always said that Canadian troops would not be on the ground in Libya. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Dilmagui. I would like to thank my colleague for her speech. After our military personnel leave Libya, we will have a huge job ahead of us to provide assistance. Over 40 years, the country has been under authoritarian rule. We need to consult Canadians of Libyan background, and we did do that kind of consultation. Many of these people work in the medical area and are medical practitioners. They have said that Canada could play an important role in developing medical infrastructure because in Libya that is practically non-existent. And I would like to know what my colleague thinks about that as a way of helping Libyans. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I pointed out in my remarks, with the funding that we are actually putting toward military intervention, which is millions of dollars a day, we could take that money and put it toward health, which would do a great deal to help the Libyan people, and I would like to emphasize that. As a nurse, I have worked in West Africa in providing assistance, so I know that the needs there are very huge, and they must be in Libya as well, and we can do that work and help them in other areas.
Member.
Questions or comments?
Interlake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from the Standing Committee on National Defence for her intervention. And she was at the briefings last week that we had from Major General Vance and from Her Excellency the Ambassador of Canada to Libya, Sandra McCradle. And they clearly outline that there is still a large area of Libya that is under the control of the pro-Gaddafi forces. They clearly stated that there is large caches of weapons and ammunition available to the pro-Gaddafi forces, and that they have an ability to strike back and fight a hard fight. And we're witnessing that now. The Gaddafi family are making all sorts of statements publicly about they're prepared to be martyrs, they're prepared to fight to the last man or woman. And we have to make sure that we get this oppressor and his forces under control so that we have the ability for diplomacy and aid to be delivered. And I just asked my honourable colleague if she would comment on the need to bring stability throughout the entire country of Libya and not just to the areas that are held now, and the role that NATO still has to play in providing security for all Libyans.
The
Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. At that meeting, I also heard that Colonel Gaddafi's forces are substantially reduced and are located mainly in 3 towns in one area, and the rebels, the new forces, are working to make gains and take control of those areas. So what I would point out is that Sorry, Mr. Speaker. So the Gaddafi forces are reduced. The National Transition Council is moving forward, and I think that they will be able to be successful.
It's the Honourable Member for Scarborough Rouge River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague did serve in uniform herself and understands the importance of our armed forces and our military, and just to follow up on my honourable colleague from over there who asked the question about costs, we know that the military intervention is very expensive. My question to my honourable colleague from Abitibi-Temiskaming is, do you think that the money would be better spent in helping to actually rebuild the country in Libya rather than in another military intervention?
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Mr. Speaker, I would point out that the money that has been invested in the military mission up till recent weeks have been very important and necessary in order to help the NTC to take Tripoli, to oust Gaddafi and so on. And now that that has been done, I think that the money has to be refocused on humanitarian aid.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And I'd ask the Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. First, je veux dire un grand félicitations.
I would like to congratulate her on her speech, and I agree with her points. However, I'm very concerned, as she is, regarding the other crimes that have been committed not just by the pro-Gaddafi forces, but also by the transitional government or young people in the civilian population who have that there has been some confusion. What does the member consider to be the threats to the civilian population? The Honourable Member. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I met with the ambassador when she came to a meeting of the Standing Committee on National Defense, and I asked her a question. What came out of that conversation was about the importance of our assistance, that is, to help Libyans to rebuild the country, to build a justice system, to make sure that the criminals on the pro-Gaddafi side, as well as on the other side, that those people be found and be brought to justice. We need major diplomatic and not military investments to be able to do that.